While Joe Chip is arguably the main character in Philip K. Dick's novel Ubik, Glen Runciter comes pretty close. He is the first character who we're going to be introduced to. He's going to play a really important role both before and after the attack, inside and outside of Half-Life and cold-pac. And he's somebody who really centers things because he is an important business owner. He owns a kind of business that is playing a pretty important role in the society that he's in. And I think that's a great place to start with an interesting observation that he is going to make. And this is happening in chapter 5. He's talking with Gigi Ashwood, one of the scouts, who actually is going to turn out to be kind of a shifty character. And Runciter is going to say, I've been in this business a long time. This is my contribution to contemporary civilization. So that's pretty important. He's saying the kind of world that we're living in now, the business that I do, it's not just making money, it's not just providing services, it's doing something really important, a contribution to civilization. What sort of contribution? Well, psionic talents have developed. We've talked about this elsewhere, so we don't need to go into great detail about that. And they intrude into people's privacy with, telepaths who can read minds, with precogs who can tell what the future possibilities are, and then which one it's going to be. So Runciter runs a prudence organization, a firm that is devoted to nullifying these talents. And there's a great talk by Joe Chip in chapter 3 about what's going on and how this helps the normal people. And I think, that's probably reflective of Runciter's own point of view on these matters. And he's going to go on. So Gigi is going to say, you're a policeman guarding human privacy. And Runciter says, you know what Ray Hollis, the leader of the biggest organization for psionic talent, says about us? He says we're trying to turn the clock back, meaning that society has moved on, just get used to it. And Runciter is saying, no, we've got to protect people and businesses and perhaps even governments and things like that. And Runciter is an incredibly dynamic person, a character that people look up to, all of the people on his team, Joe Chip in particular, right? And we also get to see Runciter as somebody who's quite aged, but still quite active. And he has a wife who died very, very young, Ella, who is in cold-pac, living in Half-Life. So we're going to get to see Runciter through the eyes of this rather fussy, people pleaser, moratorium owner. And so, we're getting an interesting take on this. A tall, elderly man with large hands and a quick, sprightly stride came towards him. I don't necessarily need to read the funny stuff that he's wearing. His head, massive like a tomcat's, thrust forward as he peered through slightly protruding, round and warm and highly alert eyes. Runciter kept on his face a professional expression of greeting, a fast attentiveness which fixed on Herbert, and then at once strayed past him, as if Runciter had already fastened on to future matters. And he says, is Ella ready to be cranked up for a talk? She's only 20. She ought to be in better shape than you or me. He chuckled, but it had an abstract quality. He always smiled, and he always chuckled. His voice always boomed, but inside, he did not notice anyone did not care. It was his body which smiled, nodded, and shook hands. Nothing touched his mind, which remained remote, aloof, but amiable. He propelled Herbert along with him, sweeping his way in great strides back into the chilled bins where the half-lifers, including his wife, lay. We get another interesting observation a little bit later from the moratorium owner. I guess when you get into that bracket, meaning Runciter's bracket, you have to act in a certain way. You have to appear more than a human with merely ordinary failings. Probably Runciter's body contained a dozen artiforgs, meaning artificial organs, grafted into place in his physiological apparatus as the genuine original ones failed. Medical science, he conjectured, supplies the material groundwork, and out of the authority of his mind, Runciter supplies the remainder. I wonder how old he is, he wondered. Impossible anymore to tell by looks, especially after 90. And there's good reason to think that he's around 80 or so, but he's not like a lot of 80-year-olds. He is, as I mentioned, incredibly dynamic. Now, we get to see Runciter's leadership at a number of different points. I think one of the best is in chapter 6 when they're up on the lunar site, supposedly fulfilling a contract. The team has been assembled. And we're going to learn some things. So here's one funny thing that comes up. Runciter says, I have a rule about my employees sleeping with one another. For or against? Zoe Wirt inquired. Against. I'm not accustomed to being told. And then she says, but you will not be staying here, Mr. Runciter. Aren't you returning to Earth as soon as your employees begin to function? And now he turns away from her and talks directly to Joe Chip. You getting any readings as to the psi field? Joe says, first I have to obtain a reading on the counterfield our inertials are generating. And then Miss Wirt says, are you attempting to take measurements? Mr. Howard expressly contraindicated that, as I explained. And Runciter says, we're taking a reading anyway. Why? Because he's prudent. He's thoughtful. And he's autonomous. He's exercising leadership. The client isn't going to boss him around, and he says it's not Stanton Mick's business, right? So a little bit later, when the person shows up, Stanton Mick, who turns out not to be a person, but actually a bomb in human form, he's going to ask Joe again. First, Stanton Mick, is saying you shouldn't be testing things, and Runciter says, leave your equipment on. You're not an employee of Mr. Mick, you're my employee. And then he gets the results from Joe. There is no field, meaning he's dealing with a robot. So Runciter immediately figures out, aha, we're in a trap. So he says, here's the description. Rapid, agitated activity crossed Runciter's face. He started to speak to Stanton Mick, then changed his mind and said to Joe in a low voice, let's get back to Earth. Let's get our inertials right out of here right now. Aloud to the others, he said, collect your possessions. We're flying back to New York. I want all of you in the ship within the next 15 minutes. Any of you who aren't in will be left behind. Joe, get all that junk of yours together in one heap. I'll help you lug it to the ship if I have to. Anyhow, I want it out of here and you with it, right? And then Stanton Mick starts to float up to the ceiling and then the bomb goes off, right? Now, as far as they know, Runciter is actually killed by it. As it's going to turn out, everybody else was killed. Runciter survived. They're in cold-pac in half-life, right? What have we seen, though? Runciter is able to very quickly size up situations. He's able to do strategic thinking about matters. He's able to respond appropriately, prudently in a lot of cases, and he takes care of his people. This is a very important attribute of him. And then throughout the chapters that follow, we get all of these interesting manifestations, which again we've talked about elsewhere, so we don't need to go into great detail. There's graffiti, there's coinage, there's messages coming through in other forms, and including television, and they're getting more and more and more elaborate and distinct as time is going on. He's trying to provide guidance to the team, and especially to Joe Chip, who he's got this very important connection to. In chapter 14, Runciter saves Joe Chip with the can of Ubik. And they have a very, very important conversation there in the hotel room after Pat Connolly has left him. She's actually being consumed by the person Jory. And Runciter reveals that he knows more about the situation than Joe does. So he says, I haven't told you all of it as a matter of fact. What I've said hasn't been strictly true. I don't hold the same relationship to this regressed world that the rest of you do. You're absolutely right. I know too much. It's because I enter it from outside, Joe. Manifestations, Joe said. Yes, thrust down into this world here and there at strategic points and times, like the traffic citation, like Archer's. You didn't tape that TV commercial, Joe said. That was live. Runciter, with reluctance, nodded. Why the difference, Joe said, between your situation and ours? You want me to say? Yes. He prepared himself, already knowing what he would hear. I'm not dead, Joe. The graffiti told the truth. You're all in cold-pac, and I'm... Runciter spoke with difficulty, not looking directly at Joe. And I think that's important, right? It shows that Runciter isn't just this tough guy, captain of industry. He cares about his people, especially Joe. He says, I'm sitting in a consultation lounge at the Beloved Brethren Moratorium. All of you are interwired on my instructions, kept together as a group. I'm out here trying to reach you. That's where I am when I say I'm outside. That's why the manifestations, as you call them, for 1 week now, I've been trying to get you all functioning in Half-Life, but it isn't working. You're fading out one by one. And Runciter says, anybody who enters into Half-Life experiences these sorts of regressions, the normal decay. And Joe says, you're lying to me. Now, this is another really important point. And he felt a knife shear through him. Staring at him, so this shows us Runciter's motivations. Runciter said, Joe, my God, I saved your life. I broke through to you just enough now to bring you back into full Half-Life functioning. You'll probably go on indefinitely now. If I hadn't been waiting here in this hotel room when you came crawling through that door, why, hell, hey, look, goddammit, you'd be lying on that rundown bed, dead as a doornail now if it wasn't for me. I'm Glen Runciter. I'm your boss, and I'm the one fighting to save all your lives. I'm the only one out here in the real world plugging for you. Right? And we read a little bit later on a similar thing. Runciter is going to say, I wanted to save your life. That part's true. Hell, I'd like to save all your lives. Right? And Joe says, well, we're all in this, and you're sitting out there out in the lounge, and you can't do it. You can't put a stop to the thing we're involved in. And Runciter says, that's right. We also read, on his face showed extreme and clear-cut unhappiness, almost a despair. Runciter is very bothered by the fact that his people are dying off, and despite his best efforts, he doesn't seem to be able to save them. And one of the reasons is because Runciter doesn't fully understand the situation. They, discuss Pat Conley, and maybe she's behind it, maybe she isn't. But we also read that Joe is going to ask him about Ubik and say, you don't know what it is or why it works. You don't even know where it comes from. A little bit earlier he says, you don't know the answers. That's the problem. You made up answers and you had to invent them to explain your presence here. All your presences, your so-called manifestations, you don't know any more than I do about what's happening to us and who's attacking us. Glenn, you can't say who we're up against because you don't know. And Runciter does say, I know I'm alive, I know I'm sitting out here in this consultation lounge in the moratorium, but he doesn't actually know who the antagonistic force genuinely is, but he does know that Ubik helps out because he sprays it on Joe and he gives it to him, right? So that's pretty important. We also find out because, in the end of that chapter, Runciter detaches the earpiece and begins, making arrangements about things. He calls the sort of person who's in charge of a potential lawsuit against the Hollis organization, Nigelman, in the North American Confederation, right? And he says, I'm going to do this tomorrow, but I need to think about what's happening with this. So he's got a very interesting set of reflections here. He says, this loss of all my best people, especially Joe Chip, my organization is depleted and we won't be able to resume commercial operations for months, maybe years. God, where am I going to get inertials to replace those I've lost? And where am I going to find a tester like Joe? A little bit later, I can't find a tester like Joe. The fact of the matter is that Runicter Associates is finished. Now, you might say, oh, well, see, he's not really that concerned about his people. He's more concerned about the organization. Runciter is the kind of person who can have multiple thoughts, multiple lines of consideration in his head at the same time. He can think about his organization. He can also be very upset about the fact that he can't save his people and barely manage to save Joe Chip in Half-Life. So I think this tells us a lot about this character, Runciter, who, by the way, his wife in cold-pac, Ella, she's moving on. She's going to designate Joe to be her replacement and help advise Runciter about the business, right? So not everything isn't completely lost. But, we've got a very interesting character developed through partly his own thoughts, partly his discourse with others, partly his actions, and partly in the eyes of others as well, in Glen Runciter in Ubik.